Hello, everybody. I'm Fran Kelly, presenter of RM Breakfast. Welcome back to CEDA's 2021 Economic and Political Outlook. It's a two-day forum. This is day one, looking at the domestic and the global outlook for this year, for 2021, which, let's face it, we all hope is dramatically different and improved on 2020, that's for sure. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. We are committed to recognition and reconciliation, and we respect elders past and present, and we support their stated aspirations. I'd also like to acknowledge the Griffith Business School for their support of this forum, this two-day forum, on behalf of CEDA. Now that 2020 is behind us, thankfully, we can begin to take stock and begin to hope. I think hope will be the catchword for 2021. Hope that the vaccine rollout, due to start next week, delivers the protection and the certainty that will bring the confidence to get businesses investing and employing, to get consumers, you and me, spending again. So far, so good, even before the vaccine arrived on our shores, as it has. But we look at events in Victoria this week too, and we know that it is perhaps a fragile piece. So hope too that our political leaders have the wisdom and the capacity to steer us out of not just the worst recession in recent political times, but also out of a period of social disruption that is unsettling and challenging at best and crippling for some at worst. This session, we're going to polish up the crystal ball to focus on the political outlook for 2021. I'll introduce our panel in a moment, but first a reminder that today, as at all CEDA events I'm sure you're familiar with, you'll be able to ask questions yourselves through a Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen, or you can head to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the password EPO 2021, there you'll be able to post your own questions. You'll be able to vote on other people's questions, which is always fun, and also vote on today's poll question. And today's poll question is, what do you think will have the biggest impact on Australian politics in 2021? And you'll see a range of options there for you to choose from. At the end of the session, I'll share the results of the winner of that question. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using hashtag EPO 2021 and tagging CEDA at CEDA News. Well, right now, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our panel and a better bunch of political journalists you couldn't hope to find in one place, can I say. Phillip Coorey is political editor with the Australian Financial Review. Laura Jays is political reporter with Sky News. And Peter Van Onselen is political editor at Network 10 and professor of politics at Griffith University and the University of WA. Welcome to you all. Thanks for your time. And turns out to be a very busy political day, I know. Phil, we'll start with you because you've actually written the essay for CEDA's 2021 Economic and Political Overview Report. So what's your outlook for this year? And first things first, do you think it's going to end up being an election year?
No, I don't. The Prime Minister doesn't want to go this year. I mean, there could be one this year. No one knows, but the PM's strong preference is to go next year. So the only way I envisage one this year is if the vaccine rollout goes perfectly and the unemployment number gets down to somewhere around 6 or less than 6%, and Labor's in a bit of a mess. If you get this perfect set of conditions, I think he'll be tempted to go, but short of that, he really wants to leave it till next year. But as to your question, Fran, as to how I see the year panning out, I think it's going to be a very small target year. As the Prime Minister said at the press club, his priorities are essentially just rolling out the vaccine, getting people back into work and reskilling those who can't find work. And he's not interested in much else beyond that in terms of reform, be it tax, industrial relations or anything else that is going to require a large amount of effort. And two reasons behind that. A, the government wants to focus its efforts on the task at hand, and B, they just feel people are really tired and have had enough upheaval and they just want to get back to something resembling how life was before, and there's no mood out there for a big reform agenda. So sort of steady as she goes, I think, is the theme for this year.
That's a very generous interpretation, isn't it, of why the government might want to stick to a small target, stick to the vaccine? Isn't it also the fact that they want to stick to that because that's where they're excelling at the moment? Things are going well. They're getting the points. It locks the opposition while things are going pretty, quite well anyway, locks the opposition out of the debate, doesn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, they're not small. They're not small tasks, the vaccine and stuff. But you're right. I mean, Well, we've just seen in the last little while, Fran, just before we came on air, that that they have jettisoned the most controversial provision of the Industrial Relations Bill, this thing that would allow employers to negotiate 2-year agreements that don't comply with the Better Off Overall test. Now, that was always going to be the hard bit to get through. On the weekend, Labor launched Work Choices style TV ads based on that provision, and that's just hit the fence in the last 10 minutes. And I think that's fairly indicative of the mindset. No distractions, get the job done. As Scott Morrison told the party room 2 weeks ago, I want the election next year, but regardless of when it's held, we will be judged on how we perform this year. So, that's politics.
Lots of politics. Laura, what about you? Are you going to be analysing everything through the lens of an election year? Sounds like even if it's not this year, we're still sort of zeroing in on that time frame, which is the problem with 3-year terms, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a statement of the bleeding obvious to say the Prime Minister will go to an election whenever he thinks he has the best opportunity of winning it. But that's the reality of things here. If he thinks he has a best opportunity of winning an election by the end of the year, and he thinks the economic outlook might get worse next year and the unemployment rate might get worse, well, he might seize that opportunity. As Phil said, the opportunities for Labor to engage in the debate have been quite minimal. You can see it in the nightly news conferences and nightly news that Labor is struggling to find oxygen in this debate. It's the politics of a pandemic that pan out this way. But look, Scott Morrison's future, the success of his party is very much predicated on the rollout of this vaccine. And I think everyone just wants their life to get back to normal. If voters think Scott Morrison is the man to get back to normality faster, well, then I think he wins. As Phil said, there's no big appetite for a big reform agenda. There is no, at the start of this crisis, we thought that politicians of all stripes might use opportunities to push through big reforms. I think the state treasurer in New South Wales is the only one that's kind of used that mantra, don't waste a crisis. But it just doesn't seem like Scott Morrison has that appetite.
Peter, what about you? Do you believe Scott Morrison when he says he's a full-termer? And in the end, can politicians really be guided by the polls? We used to think it'll be, a lot depends on the polls. But Labor last time, they backed the polls and look what happened.
Yeah, look, I think he'll be guided by what is in his best self-interest when the time comes. So if suddenly calling an election at the end of this year looks like the best political move for him because it looks like there might be a move away from him, if he lays that, I think he'll go to the election late this year, as long as he doesn't think the odium of having suggested he wouldn't becomes a reason not to do so. But if he thinks he's still travelling well and there's no indication of that changing by the time we get to the first half of next year, then I think Phil's right. He'll likely just go full term, as he has indicated to his own party room that he wants to do. But the interesting thing for me is this idea of whether there would or wouldn't be any form of reform. And the short answer to that is that there wouldn't be. I think you've got to understand Scott Morrison to really understand why that's the case. In many ways, he's not a Howard-esque Liberal leader or Prime Minister. He's not a reformer. He's an old-fashioned Conservative Prime Minister, more like what Malcolm Fraser was before he became more of a policy radical in retirement. He judges his success by simply winning elections and presiding rather than necessarily reforming. I thought, just quickly, his answer to a question that Phil asked at the press club, where he basically said, putting up taxes isn't tax reform, displayed a profound ignorance about how tax reform works. Tax reform is, by definition, some taxes going up so that others can go down, so that the overall mix becomes hopefully a more efficient tax structure. But he just doesn't want to go there because he judges his political success the way traditional Conservatives do, which is keeping Labor away from the Treasury benches.
So, Phil,
if I could jump in, Fran, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, I think Scott Morrison himself acknowledges, and he's already told us at the press club, as you've already reminded us, he's not into big reform this year. He's more a manager, and that's what he sees his job, keeping things on track. Does that mean then the big test coming up to the next election is the management of the vaccine?
Yes, I've just lost you there, Fran, but... I
can hear you, Phil, so you keep going if you're not slowed down.
Okay, going. Yeah,
just on Fran's end.
Yeah, look, Morrison, he's not a policy guy. He never was, even before this. He's not a innovator. He's a fixer and a manager. He fixes problems. His whole ministerial career was about fixing things. He stopped boats. He sorted out the pension mess that Tony Abbott created with the 2014 budget. And when he became Treasurer, he set a deadline for returning the surplus, which would have been achieved had it not been for this. So you hand him a problem and he fixes it. You sort of turn the key in his neck and point him towards it, and he'll fix it. And that's why I think he's been this crisis has been tailor-made to him. But he's not a reform guy. But when the premiers all came up here in, was it November, December, for their first face-to-face meeting since the crisis began, we asked them then of that, because it's not just the federal government that's not interested in reform, apart from Dominic Perrottet. I said, no one's got an election in 2021 except WA. We've got this 12-month window of no election politics, all these problems with the Federation and so forth that have been exposed by this crisis. Was there any discussion at the COAG meeting maybe we could use the window of opportunity and try some reform? And they all looked at me like I was an idiot. I just got these blank stares. I was like, nah. They all just want to manage this crisis.
Yeah, and look, Phil, I think I agree with you there that there's just Scott Morrison just has no appetite to allow those ideological fights to flourish that we saw under Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott, and he's been able to temper that down. I mean, I only saw very slight hints of it on this media reform and this media code debate. Some of the purists were talking about, whether this is in line with their free market ideals. But in the end, they've got a deal. And again, he was able to keep that ideological debate at bay. And that's just one of the examples.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you've got your back.
Speaking of ideological debates, let's go to climate, because before the pandemic hit, the world was watching as Australia burned, and climate change was front of mind for most of us, that's for sure. Scott Morrison's initial management of that crisis was not so polished. He really fumbled that. But we are being reminded, we're only a few weeks into this political year, and every day we are being reminded that our political parties seem to be unable, ill-equipped to come up with a climate policy. The Prime Minister wants to focus on the vaccine rollout, but he is aware that external forces means that there will be demands for some kind of change of climate policy. I'm talking about pressure from global leaders and pressure from the climate itself. Laura, is the PM really prepared to do what needs to be done here, well, as much as he's going to be forced to do?
No, he's back to that whole idea is that he doesn't want to fight. And I think the comments that he made at the National Press Club that everyone got excited about by him moving the dial ever so slightly to zero net emissions by 2050, I think that people looking at that were more hopeful than they were realistic about what Scott Morrison is trying to say. He does not want this fight. He doesn't see that there's a political imperative in it for him either. Yes, we had the summer of bushfires at the end of 2019, 2020, but the COVID-19 crisis has overtaken that absolutely. Again, going back to the party internals, this is the first time in a long time that you're not having the moderates and conservatives fight over this issue in a very public way. So will he be pressured by leaders, Joe Biden, Boris Johnson and the like? Well, look, to be honest, I think he's going to pay lip service to the issue. He's not going to move from the stance of, there needs to be a plan, because you saw the reaction just from the Nationals last week. But the comparisons globally are just extraordinary as well. I mean, Boris Johnson just this week said he wants to make the UK the Saudi Arabia of wind, whereas here we can't even have a renewable energy target nor a conversation about getting to electric cars. But to be honest, Fran, I don't think it's going to hurt him.
Well, in reality, we are the Saudi Arabia of solar, if we want to take that maximum and go further. But that's at an individual level. That's nothing to do, really, with federal policy. But, Peter, do you think Laura's right that he'll be able to ignore the pressure or somehow come up with some formulation to keep Joe Biden and Boris Johnson and others off our backs, or more importantly, keep carbon levies, if these jurisdictions do introduce them, off the backs of our exporters?
Yeah, by and large, I do. Certainly in this electoral cycle, I think it's perhaps something that becomes pointier for the Prime Minister when he wins the election, if he wins the election in the following term, But leading up to the election that we're going to have either late this year or early next year, I think exactly as Laura says, the vaccine, the management of the pandemic, and then maybe some economic issues around that are much more likely to be the focus. And with minimal reform from either major party, a lack of reform isn't even going to hurt him amongst his base. So really Scott Morrison's aim in the climate space is to defer the problem, and whether that defers it to his problem in another term in power or indeed a successor's problem, it's still deferred. And in the meantime, he'll pay some lip service to it, as Laura suggests, to try to, if you like, do enough to not be seen as being completely lacking agility in this space, but not do too much that he riles up those backbenchers, particularly on the national side, because he might be really secure as Liberal leader, but Michael McCormack is far less secure as national leader. And so if Scott Morrison tries to shift the coalition collectively as the Liberal leader, he doesn't want to upset all those Queensland LNP nationals or indeed other nationals around the country that could cause McCormack instability, which then can always have a flow-on effect.
But Phil, that's the domestic scenario, but it can only be a holding pattern, can't it, if the rest of the world is moving and demanding change?
Fran, I've got a slightly different view to Pete and Laura. I actually think Morrison does get it and does want to change. And he's been doing it right under our noses now for the last year or 18 months. But he has to do it in a way. It's a bit like turning around the QE2. It's a slow process moving the Liberal Party or the coalition. The point a lot of people missed when he gave a press club address last year when he talked about gas being the transition fuel of the future. Mm-hmm. In doing so, he steered away from coal, and very few people noticed it. One of the whole aims of that whole gas-led recovery, both that he announced in the middle of last year and his speech at the start of the year, he gave a whole speech on Australia's energy future, and he didn't mention coal. And a few people picked it up, but not many.
I think Matt Canavan picked it up.
Yeah, but a lot of people then jumped ugly on him for going to gas. When in fact what he was doing was steering the coalition away from coal. He's not passionate about climate change or whatever, but he accepts it's happening, and he accepts the capital markets have made up their minds, and the future is clean energy, and you have to do it, and you have to get on board. And he has to bring the coalition around to that realisation without doing two things, splitting the party or destroying his leadership. And he's been doing it in little baby steps, and he's doing it again on net zero. His aim on net zero is to approach it in baby steps, so when you take the final step, it's a step, not a leap. Even with the ballyhoo from the Nationals in the last couple of weeks, it wasn't the whole party, it was just the outliers. It was Barnaby, Canavan and Bridget McKenzie. And even McKenzie was just seeking the same caveats that Morrison gave at the press club. I'm only going to do it if I can detail how to get there using technology and that farmers aren't adversely affected. So he gets it. He gets it from a pragmatic financial economic point of view. We've got to go clean energy. In terms of combating climate change, it's tiny in terms of achievement, but in terms of shifting attitudes in the coalition, it's quite significant. And I think he will do net zero by the next election. I really do. And the whole MO is to go around Barnaby and Canavan rather than trying to go through them. Turnbull tried to go through them, and it cost him his job.
Yeah, Laura, come to you on that. I mean, it's tiny, it's slow. It's what Phil's just spelled out for us there. Yeah. But the point is, there is external pressure for it to happen more quickly. I mean, let me bring in a question from the audience here, which is not directly to this, but goes to where we started and can certainly take us to climate. It's that COVID presented us an opportunity to change the way we see the world and an opportunity to bring reforms for generations to come. Any chance of these happening this year or next? Well, I think we've sort of the three of you have suggested no, but it goes to climate change and really the point of under the guise of a pandemic, there is an opportunity for looking through our manufacturing policy and huge investment policy of restructuring where we go on energy, a homegrown energy market, all that sort of thing, and a restructuring to renewable energy. But the Prime Minister the steps are absolutely minuscule in terms of giving any kind of leadership or signals to the industry to make that happen, aren't they?
Well, we have to make sure that we don't become protectionist either, and that's not a result of this pandemic and where we end up. Yes, there's been a great conversation, I think a much needed one, about Australia needed to be more self-sufficient at home when it comes to certain areas. I mean, we just look at the backlash from China at the moment. The lived experience isn't quite hitting us as much, but the threats are certainly there from China. But, you know, time and time again, we hear from political leaders, particularly on Scott Morrison's side of politics, that we can't let ourselves get too parochial about that. Phil is 100% right that Morrison's taking baby steps here on climate change, and I think he's much better at the politics around this because he understands what he can and can't do with his own party. Those baby steps, though, will be too slow from some on the left that are demanding that he needs to do more now. Absolutely, in the future, it's not about the environment. It needs to be an investment, a climate argument about jobs. Now, if the coalition, indeed, if Labor can get the conversation to be about economics rather than the environment, well, I think you're going to bring people together in the middle more easily. And just one final point on that, Morrison moving forward on this again, it's not going to be. But this is the argument that they've kind of been fashioning in New South Wales as well. But it hasn't got traction, and there are no votes in it for him at this immediate next election.
Okay, we've got a lot of audience questions coming in, but before we get to them, I'll go to China, though. I will note this one come in from Anonymous saying Texas generates... Oh, it's gone from my screen, therefore I can't give it to you. I'll get it back. Let's go to China, and then we'll go to some more of the flavour of what the audience is wanting to hear from you. Peter, China's become a political management problem with massive consequences, potentially, and already in real terms, for our economy and strategic security. Has the Morrison government given up on trying to mend this problem? Because I suppose that's not really a luxury it has.
No, not at all. It hasn't given up. I mean, there's an argument that along the way there's been elements of mismanagement of it, but it then comes back to your feeling about the bullishness that China's displayed towards Australia and indeed other countries, and the fact that there's been some standing up to that. This is now a permanent problem for Australia going forward. This government, and indeed Labor, is no different. They don't in any way underestimate the importance to our economic stability of the China relationship. The question is whether they can get it back on the keel that it was once on. I suspect that this is the new normal going forward, that there is a tenseness in the relationship with immediate consequences, retaliatory consequences. The government doesn't like that. The government isn't going to, if you like, pretend that it's not happening. But by the same token, there is a strong suggestion, I think, coming from the Morrison government that they're certainly not going to be prepared to be being seen as kowtowing to China when they do decide to bristle at our view towards them. And a lot of people, democratically speaking, would like that, of course. But I think that is interesting in and of itself. And I don't have a problem with that, notwithstanding the incredible economic problems that this all creates.
I mean, not kowtowing is one thing, but Phil, what do they do then? In your essay in the Outlook report, you said there's no point treating the actions of China, and we're talking about the trade bans and the tariffs on barley, wine, beef and everything else, no point treating them as legitimate trade gripes because they're not. But that has been our government's response so far generally to threaten taking China to the WTO or challenging under current trade rules. What else can the government do? Because sure, don't kowtow, but what can they do? They cannot just do nothing.
Look, I think just hope for a bit of silent diplomacy now, Fran. Keep beavering away at an official level, at an embassy level. But I think you'll note in the last few months, I've certainly put away the megaphone since Christmas. And there's a great deal of hope that with Biden coming in the US, that there was a view inside government that part of the problem with China, not all of it, was Trump's combative stance with China and our alliance with the US didn't augur well for us. We were in some part collateral damage from that whole thing. So if Biden manages to bring that whole temperature down publicly, there's a more sort of a reversion to a more sort of traditional relationship with the US and China, and just brings the whole temperature down. That will somehow help with us. That's been countered also by the strong view that Xi's out to sort of really make an example of us because we have caused him a disproportionate amount of grief for a country so small. You know, we have led on things like Huawei, we've led global opinion on stuff like that. They see us as a dangerous upstart and they want to crush us as an example. So there's no expectation in government that this is going to be resolved anytime soon. There's now a resignation that where as best as you can, exporters have to find alternative markets, though you're never going to replace the demand that China has created. But it's a slow rebuild, I think, and hopefully as Morrison said again the other day, my phone's still there. I'm sitting by the phone, I'm waiting the call, but you'll see the backbenchers have largely been told to shut up, and the other protagonists, and just take that element out of it, and maybe someone will pick up the phone in the not too distant future.
Laura, let's hope the new Trade Minister, Dan Tehan, that they've got his phone number because he's the one we need to be talking to them. But do you think, and PVO sort of hinted at this, in an election year, is there mileage too in being seen to stand up to China right now? Is the Prime Minister at the point where, okay, we haven't been able to crack this, they won't take our phone calls, well, we're just going to make a point of not kowtowing, to use Peter's language?
Well, there's two elements to this. There's a security element and the economic one. And I think the Australian people and those that are engaged in it know that a lot of our jobs and our trade, our economic stability is predicated on a good relationship with China. You mentioned Dan Tehan. I think he's the right person to be in this position for this time. He's a former department official. He worked for DFAT. He knows how diplomacy works. But there's not good science, Fran, because he wrote before Christmas to his new counterpart, and he has not yet got a reply, and that was as of last week. So those lines of communication have not opened up yet, and that's even with a new Prime Minister, a new Trade Minister in Australia, and his counterpart in China is also new as well. There's a big crisis emerging when it comes to tertiary education. This is Australia's third biggest export before this crisis. We've seen 17,000 jobs lost at our universities. And as late as last week, you have the Chinese ministry undercutting and kind of downplaying, ruining the reputations of the quality of Australian universities and the education coming out of it. So we've got a long way to go, and I think that sector is going to bear the brunt of it.
Look, time is going to disappear on us very quickly. So let's go to the economy. The government's been buoyed. I think, by the way, the economy is bouncing back. Unemployment better than was expected. Confidence, investment better than expected. JobKeeper and to a lesser extent JobSeeker, very key to that. Clearly, the Australian policy has worked on that front. The tap's about to be turned off, Peter. The PM says we can't keep living on the credit card forever. But is March 31st too soon?
Look, I don't think the tap is going to be turned off at the end of March. I think it's just going to become more targeted and less indiscriminate. It's already been a baby step towards it not being so indiscriminate with some of the adjustments from the very beginning of JobKeeper to what is still on offer for businesses that are still relying on it and their employees. I think down below we're around 1.5 million now from 3.5 million sort of around September last year. What I think we're likely to see at the end of March, and I don't really understand why they haven't felt the need to clarify some of this now as we creep closer to it, unless they haven't finalised it perhaps. But I do think we're going to see significant targeted ongoing assistance. Now, whether that is targeted to sectors or geographical areas or a combination of the two, I think it's a bit of a misnomer that JobKeeper ends and that's the cliff and therefore we've got a problem. The government is feeding that almost to some extent. Maybe there's a political motive in that. They want people to be worried about it, to see how important it is, and then turn around and pull the rabbit out of the hat and say, how good are we that we've managed to extend it now? So I think that is going to be important because without that, frankly, I think that becomes a very dark cloud on what has been some pretty good economic news in the wake of it compared to what the original forecasts were.
Phil, do you agree with that? And also, do you agree that in a sense, this government, especially heading 12 or 15 months away from election, whatever we are, is in a very fortunate position in one way because the debt and deficit shackles are gone. No one's talking or worried about that anymore. So they could certainly keep subsidising sectors like tourism, and on other issues we're expecting a massive amount of money to be spent on aged care. When we get the Aged Care Royal Commission report, that will involve a lot of money, which I think the government's going to have to respond to. Do you think the spending is going to keep on coming?
Yeah, but nothing like the rate it is now. As Morrison said at the press club, as Simon Birmingham said last week, debt repayments are manageable at the moment because of interest rates are so low. They're actually they're costing us less now than they did before, but that's not going to last forever. And if interest rates rise, if the 15-year average becomes the 10-year average, you can add 50 billion to debt, just in interest payments alone by the end of this decade. So they are mindful of debt. They know they've got to stop accruing it. As soon as unemployment gets well below 6%, which will be sometime next term, they're going to flick the switch towards budget repair. We're not there yet, so they will keep spending until that point is reached, but it'll be nothing on the scale we've seen now. Peter's right, there will be sectoral support. They've now listed aviation, international tourism and international students. I think one of the problems, Fran, is Victoria is complicating it. One of the ministers said to me yesterday, it's almost turning into a Victoria package because that state has become such a basket case in comparison with the rest. We saw those job seeker numbers on Monday. Far more people still dependent on JobKeeper in Victoria than anywhere else in the country. So these are all things they've got to weigh up. But look, they know it's coming. They know they've got to turn off JobKeeper. They were planning to do this in October last year, remember, when we were talking about a 6-month problem. They were factoring in a depressed December quarter because of it. The Victorian crisis has pushed that to where we are now. So it's going to be a pretty rough, June quarter. So, I think unemployment probably won't go up, but it will plateau. The recovery may plateau for a bit. They're baking that in. That's another reason why I don't think they're rushing to an election this year either.
Yeah, so things aren't terrific, but they're not nearly as bad as people were fearing either. And that all makes it more difficult. We've mentioned this, but difficult for an opposition. The politics of pandemics leave very little space for an opposition. We've been talking for 30 minutes and we've barely talked about them. Anthony Albanese is trying to cut through and give Labor some ground to fight on with his industrial relations package he released last week, which also very focused on the shape of the economy, the shape of work in the modern Australian economy, which really came into the forefront a bit during the pandemic. We saw just how many people are working many jobs, work casual shifts, have many employers, are mobile, and the lack of conditions that, if you know anyone who's in that situation that come with that. Laura, do you think that that's going to work for Anthony Albanese and Labor?
No, I don't. They've got to try, and this is probably the best opportunity for them to get the focus onto insecure work. But in the end, this is going to be a pandemic election, and those huge improvements, and depending on when JobKeeper comes off and the targeted assistance from the federal government for those sectors that Phillip and Pete mentioned, it's really hard for Anthony Albanese to fight against the politics there. He wants a fight, but the federal government isn't giving it to him. We saw that, as Phil mentioned, just before we started this live broadcast. They've already dropped the most contentious part of it, and that is the changes to the Better Off Overall test. So, look, what the government is proposing is pretty modest. What Labor is trying to do is talk about all those, it argues, millions of Australians with insecure work, but it's not as black and white. Already Labor's seeing problems with the argument in a public sense that, what about the cost of food delivery? Is that going to go up? So there's questions around that, what it costs and what it will cost business at a time where some are still struggling, will still struggle to survive.
Let's, an issue to a burning to talk about IR. I'd like to go to a couple of questions because it seems to me there's a bit of theme running from the questions coming from the audience. Takes us back to where we started, which is the pandemic and the management of it, and particular concern about lockdowns. Chris Gale asks, beyond the simple following of health advice, are there political factors driving state premiers when they impose short, sharp lockdowns? Yes. Okay, Phil, yes. But, a lot of those elections that we were seeing through that frame, they've passed now, and yet we've still seen short, sharp lockdowns in South Australia and in Queensland, Perth, WA, they're still heading to an election. So where do you think the politics of it are?
Well, the extremity of the responses have been directly proportional with the proximity of elections, Fran, in Queensland and WA. I mean, Perth only opened their doors last night to New South Wales. You know, I mean, it is.
But that's not the only factor. I mean, South Australia.
No, I know, but what I'm saying is completely inconsistent. The approaches different premiers are taking. They all have their own set of rules. Even their medical advice appears to be different, and there's an uncanny resemblance to the proximity of an election. Now, I think what Daniel Andrews has done is different insofar his election isn't to the end of next year, but people are just so burnt out down there, and the reaction to this latest lockdown has been so visceral. I think he's actually felt it for the first time, and I think he's just announced while we've been on air that they're going to lift on Thursday, or they should lift on Thursday. And he's got to be mindful of his next election, even though it's 18 months away, because he's got the economy of his estate is in a real mess. We were talking just a second ago about the government withdrawing these economic supports. That also gives the premiers further grist for when it comes to locking down, because they can't rely on the feds picking up the bill anymore. I mean, it's easy to say, we're going to lock down for a week or a month or whatever. We're going to shut our borders to everyone from New South Wales and Victoria in the case of Queensland, because everyone in the tourism industry is going to be getting JobKeeper. Or they can't rely on that anymore, and the feds have been making noises about it's time the states stuck their hand in their own pocket, especially Queensland and others. So I suspect they're going to have to be a bit more judicious about lockdowns and a bit more confident in their own systems and, follow the New South Wales model. I mean, Berejiklian and here in the ACT have been able to operate fairly well without subjecting their citizens to the same restrictions that other states have. So, it's not a concept. It's shown it can be done. And I suspect once the WA election's out of the way, they'll probably lighten up a bit there too.
Peter, do you have a view on whether the lockdowns are simply being employed for political purposes or not simply? I mean, obviously it's not only that. And you agree with Phil that behaviour will change? New South Wales is trying to show another way.
Well, I certainly think that there was politics in, if you like, the state border shutdowns for both Queensland and WA in the lead up to elections. But as you pointed out, Fran, there was also that sort of attitude in other states, including Liberal Premier states, which didn't have elections on the horizon. But that, I guess those two things can awkwardly go together. What I find interesting about the health advice is that I'm hearing that there is some frustration, even in some states that you might think are naturally interested in short, sharp lockdowns, in having to politically go down that path because they're afraid to act against the health advice in that situation. The last thing you'd want to do as a premier would be to ignore your epidemiologist telling you a short lockdown will be important here if there then was an outbreak, because that would just be political suicide for you. So that's an interesting one. The other one I find interesting, which is not the time to go into, is just the border wars as such, because I find it, I've always described myself as a federalist, but I sort of feel like it's ridiculous the way that states are able to lock down against one another the way that they do when the Commonwealth doesn't agree. But I don't know what the solution is, because it's the states that run the health departments, the police, and all that management. So it's not something that if you handed it to the feds somehow, if that was even possible, that necessarily they're better placed to manage, because then it is state governments that are managing the public policy ramifications of what it means to have open borders, depending on where that leads.
Well, there are also those who think that Australia's infection rates have been kept low because of the employment of border closures. Laura, just to you, another question, sort of not directly on this, so take it where you want, but JT asks, can the current bunch in the National Cabinet truly become a forum for nation building, or have the relationships between the PMs, premiers and territory leaders been too damaged by the border closure spats? What do you think? Does it have an ongoing role, and has it worked? I mean, in many ways, I think it's been fantastic.
Yeah, National Cabinet has worked to a level. Now, they don't always get into National Cabinet and come out with a uniform resolution, which has been frustrating. But, if Phil and Pete have ever been to one of the normal meetings of state and territory leaders, well, they usually come out with platitudes of nothing after those yearly meetings. So at least this pandemic has focused the mind on actually achieving some things. But I just want to demonstrate explain to you something that probably demonstrates everything there is to say about the politics of shutdowns and border closures. Well, look at where Scott Morrison has come in the last 6 months. He was very heavily critical of the economic ramifications of border closures and snap lockdowns 6 to 8 months ago, but now he is completely changed. And we have 3 cases in New Zealand, and then he shut off the border bubble. So I think not only has his politics changed, but he's probably getting some research and advice that people just want to be kept safe. And the economy, border closures and snap lockdowns are a second tier. But, also as a Prime Minister, he's going to be the one that has to deal with it. The short answer there is, can the Premiers and the Prime Minister nation build? Yeah, I think they're above the little political tit-for-tat jibes we see on a daily basis. I hope so.
Okay.
Anyway.
We are out of time, but let me do a quick whip around to all of you for our poll question before I tell everyone who's won the audience's choice. Peter, what do you think will have the biggest impact on Australian politics in 2021? Do you want me to go through the options?
If this isn't there, then I just think it should be, and I'm critical of the organisers. Vaccines, I think, is the biggest issue of 2021.
Okay, Phil?
Well, they go together, vaccine/economy. You can't separate the two. The latter is dependent on the former.
Okay, and Laura?
Jobs.
Jobs.
Jobs. It all comes back to vaccines, the economy, but essentially... Are you trying
to get an interview with Albo, Laura? He'll love to hear that.
People want to know that the job that was there before the pandemic, they need it after.
Okay, well, I'm just going to give you the audience answers now. Peter, you were closest. You were right. The audience has 50% says the success of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout is going to have the biggest impact on Australian politics in 2021. 25% of you thought the performance of the Australian economy, so that goes to you, Phil, and to Laura too. 13% said international pressure on climate change policy, and 10% say developing trade tensions and our relationship with China. So all the themes we've spoken about today, but run away. The government's first job is to make sure they manage this vaccine rollout. Let's hope that the vials arrive. Let's hope the logistics of it go smoothly. Let's hope the Australian population puts its hand up in enough numbers, which I'm told really is over 90%, to make it really, really effective. And let's hope that this coronavirus, this COVID-19, can't sort of outrun the different vaccines we come up with, the different variants. So, look, thank you, all of you, for joining us. That's all we've got time for. A big thank you to all of you who participated with the questions. And thanks again to our panel, Phil Coorey from the Australian Financial Review, Laura Jays from Sky News, and Peter Van Onselen from Network 10 and the Griffith Business School. Thank you, panel.
Thanks, Fran.
Thanks, Fran.
Thanks to the Griffith Business School for sponsoring this 2-day forum. Day 2 tomorrow focuses on the international political and economic outlook, and it kicks off with something not to be missed, I think, in the current climate, and that's a keynote address with Australia's ambassador to the US, Arthur Sinodinos, and Arthur will then be sitting down with David Spears for a discussion on the global outlook, political and economic, particularly, I think, in terms of the relationships between the US and China. So don't miss that. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today.